This is talking about having the mind of Christ. And as we think about the mind of Christ in our life and the attitude that we're to have toward other individuals, today I want to talk about and look at a parable that Jesus gave to his disciples in Matthew chapter 13. It is the parable of the wheat and tares, and you think, well, why do we need, or how helpful would a sermon on wheat and tares be? And that in itself helps us to recognize that there are things that Jesus says that sometimes pass over our head, if not oftentimes. So I'd like, first of all, to read this parable. It is one of several parables, evidently, that he gave on the same day in a sermon or in a conversation, as you might look at, that he was giving. So Jesus told them this parable here, beginning in verse 24 of Matthew 13. Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. And when the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servant came to him and said, "Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from?" "An enemy did this," he replied. The servants asked him, "Do you want us to go and to pull them up?" "No," he answered, "because while you're pulling the weeds, you may root up the wheat with them. Let them both grow together until the harvest. At that time I will tell the harvesters first to collect the weeds, and then in bundles to be burned. Then gather the wheat and bring them into my barn." So that's a simple thing. Well, it's not quite as simple as we might think. And it's not simple because of several things. One, Jesus gave this parable. Number two, it was important enough that it was written in the Bible and preserved for us. Number three, I think after the fact, it made an impact on the disciples that they didn't understand immediately. So the story of every farmer or every gardener can relate to the fact that there are things that are hidden in the garden. There are problems that we have, things that don't meet our eye, and all of us have had to deal with weeds. Jim and I attempted to go get some compost yesterday. I say attempted because it didn't work out exactly as I had planned. But one of the purposes of that is use the compost not only to fertilize, but to keep weeds down in my garden, or the community garden that I am working with. So when we look at that, we all have to deal with it. Back where I came from, the weed of choice was not marijuana, though it did grow wild back there. And we were kind of unaware. We called it loco weed and the like, but you could go get it any time. Not that I have, and because I haven't. But the weed of choice was ragweed and thistles is what we had back there. Now, they're easy to recognize as being weeds. They don't look like green beans. They don't look like corn and the like. But the weed that we're talking about here in this particular parable that Jesus is given to us, they were called tares. And they were weeds that would come up. They were semi-poisonous weeds that came up. And when we look at the parables of Jesus, there are some things as we start this that I want us to be aware of. Especially the fact that Jesus' parables are the most famous and best known stories in the world. Because you can begin to quote a parable and people, they may not be able to remember exactly where it came from, but they're familiar with it. And Jesus is especially allowing his audience to easily relate to a common background of the story. So when I talk about weeds and I talk about crops, in this case weeds and tares, most of us can identify this because every farmer knows about crops and knows about weeds. And when we think about crops, we think about the good seed and weed as the bad seed. Now there's a saying that goes, this year's seed is 7 years of weeds, because you can plow. There were laws, actually there were Roman laws that were quite punishable crimes if you planted in somebody's garden. There was some guy in India who, as a part of vengeance, planted something, and the guy could never get rid of it. It's kind of like if you were to plant bamboo in somebody's yard. When it starts sprouting, or in the south, it's kudzu. Kudzu just keeps coming and coming and growing and growing and growing. And so they would do that. So one might come away from Jesus' parable or presentation thinking, I get it, but what difference does it make in my life? And I'm going to suggest this is the approach or the attitude that the disciples themselves had. Hey, we can take care of this weed problem. A little Roundup will take care of it. And I say that because we recognize there in Roundup now is supposedly causes cancer, and there are all kinds of. It's like the answer to their problem isn't the answer that Jesus is getting at. And then we can hear only the literal interpretation, missing Jesus' meaning and purpose. So the wheat and tare parable is quite likely, when Jesus is giving this parable, there's a good chance that his audiences, because he's sitting on the lake and the like, that his audiences could probably look out behind them or around them and see fields. There's a good chance that they may well have walked through those fields and that they would have seen wheat and weeds growing at that time. And so they would be very aware of this. Now, the parable defined as an early story, a parable is defined as an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. Now, this is what Jesus says in this particular parable. He says, the kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seeds in a field, but while everyone is sleeping. So this has a connection to a heavenly meaning. Therefore, it is important. It has a universal appeal to an ordinary man with an ordinary mind. So, and then the way that we think in our human mind is by these ordinary stories, by these ordinary parables. We have flashes, we have pictures in our own mind, and we're able to kind of connect as a result of that. Now, I want to say this because we're talking about Jesus talking to the people of his day. I do want to make a little side note. The side note being about the basic difference between a Greek and a Jewish mind. So he's talking to basically a Jewish congregation. Now, the thing is about Greeks, and I know a few Greeks, is that they love an argument for the sake of an argument, and they don't have to reach a conclusion. That would drive me nuts, and it does drive me nuts. Now, I'm not saying that I'm Jewish, but I'm just saying that kind of reason, just argue and feel like, oh man, we just had a great debate. Wasn't that a lot of fun? I'm thinking, no. Why do we spend all this time debating things? And this is kind of like sometimes when we have an attitude towards even theology. People will debate. If God is so all powerful and the like, can he make a rock or something that's bigger than him and he's not able to lift? And then we can have this argument. Or the argument, if nobody's in the forest and a tree falls, Is there any sound? Does it make any sound? These kind of ridiculous kind of arguments. On the other hand, the Jewish mind tends to want to reach and find a conclusion, and then upon that conclusion, take action. So Jesus didn't just argue abstractly, using only ideas a few people would understand, so that he could be understood and the like. He didn't use that. He used some very common approaches in explaining something that is heavenly. Jesus presented a common picture, stories that are relatable to his audience. However, when we think about this and we read this, so having read this, do we think that if Jesus were to present today, I'm reading it from the Bible, and you are already familiar with this parable, but if Jesus were standing up here today and he says, I want to tell you something. I want to give you a story that the kingdom of heaven is like unto a man that sowed good seeds, and his enemy came. And he gave this little short quip, this little short parable. What value would you really think it was? Would you think, what's that all about? And would you consider it something that is worth repeating, something worth thinking about? Would you think that maybe, okay, I understand that. We got wheat and we got weeds. That's life. That's all there is to it. Well, I think it would be wise if Jesus were presenting this and he gave just this little part right here, rather than get up and leave after the fact, it might be wise to ask him a few questions. We might start off with something like, Lord, what was that all about? I understand weeds and I understand wheat, but what are you saying? So, with that thought in mind, I want to move back a little bit because he'd given a parable before this. It's a parable about the sower. And in this, I think that we might begin to get some understanding of how to approach this parable. So, Jesus had just been encountering people. They were challenging him. They were asking him to give a sign. And he gave him, the sign of Jonah, and wicked people look after a sign. And then he asked, well, your mother and your brothers are outside. And he said, well, who are my mothers and brothers? He said, my disciples. And he pointed to his disciples. And then in this context, Matthew writes, verse 1 of Matthew 13, that same day, Jesus went out of the house and he sat by the lake. Such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat in it. And while all the people stood on the shore, then he told them many things in parables, saying. So here we have a large audience, and Jesus is telling them many things in parables. It's like, oh my, the poet is really at it today. He's telling us stories. They're good campfire stories and the like. He talks about this parable of the farmer that goes and sells good seeds, sows good seeds and the like, and some grow and some don't grow. Now, verse 10 is interesting because the disciples then challenged Jesus, and the disciples came to him and asked, why do you speak to the people in parables? Now, that's a good question. Why do you speak to them in parables, and why am I even speaking about a parable of Jesus today? And he replied, the knowledge of the king and the secrets of the kingdom of heaven have been given to you, but not to them. Now, okay, what are the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven? He says, whoever has will be given more, and he will have abundance. Whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him. This is why I speak to them in parables. And if you're not careful, it's hard to get and understand what he's saying here. Though seeing, they do not see. And though hearing, they do not hear. So then it says, in them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah. You will be ever hearing and never understanding. You will be ever seeing and never perceiving. For this people's heart has become callous, and they hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and then I would heal them. So, having told this story, given this parable, one would assume that they didn't understand much of anything. Well, they did understand. They understand. They had probably just walked through the field, and if I tell you that if you're walking down a path and it's a hard path and you throw seeds on it, or in our case, it's a concrete sidewalk, and seeds are on there, you're going to say, it's not going to grow. If anything, a seed might come up in the crack, and if it does come up in the crack, it'll grow a little while, and then in the heat of summer, it's going to dry out and wither up and the like. And then we think, well, seeds sown over here where the weeds are and the like. Well, those weeds, we all know that. We all understand that, and we all understand, well, oh my, here's a place where the soil is fertile. It's just easy to work with. We put those seeds in and they grow. So what Jesus is saying, even though they see, they don't understand and they don't perceive. What don't they see and what don't they not understand? So Jesus is telling you disciples, it's you to understand the secrets of the kingdom of heaven. So let me ask you a question. Then why does Jesus go on then to explain to his disciples what this means? Have you ever sat in a class where everybody is not getting it, and even you are not really getting it, but you're afraid to ask the professor, can you explain this to me? Because I appear not to be really understanding. And everybody leaves the class as if they understand what's going on. But what Jesus says to them here, but blessed are your eyes, this is verse 16, because they see, and your ears because they hear. For I tell you the truth, many of the prophets and the righteous men longed to see what you see, but did not see it, and to hear what you hear, but did not hear it. And then he begins to explain to his disciples, his followers. Listen then to what the parable of the sower means. When anyone hears the message about the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in the heart. This is the seed sown along the path. And then he goes and he explains this. It's kind of like people who write poems, and you have literature professors asking you to what is the author trying to tell us, and what do we get out of all this? But Jesus goes back and he explains the meaning to disciples who may well have thought that they knew what he meant, but were afraid to ask himself. So one of Jesus' greatest reasons for using parables is to persuade men to pass a judgment on things which they are well acquainted with, and then compel them to transfer that judgment into something to whose significance they have been blinded by. So when this parable of the sower ends up, Jesus is talking about the good seed, and how that the good seed, some produces 30-fold, 60-fold, and 100-fold. Now, with that thought in mind, what might a disciple of Christ begin to ask himself? Lord, since you said that the Father is glorified by producing much fruit, what percentage am I? Am I producing, first of all, am I good seed? Am I producing 30-fold, 60-fold, or 100-fold? Am am I doing what you want me to do? Because, the responsibility that we have to be faithful in little also applies to the production within our life of producing fruit that God has called us, walking in God's will. And so all of a sudden, we may have an aha moment to something that we were blind in, thinking, okay, everything is good. Now, I want to give us an example of a parable used in the Old Testament, because parables were used oftentimes back there to explain something. But this is to focus on the fact that Jesus gives us a parable of something that we can quickly come to understand on the surface. But then we come to a point that it hits a blind spot. So in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verses 1 through 7, there's an example here of a parable that Nathan gives. And so this parable that Nathan gives says here in 2 Samuel 12, verses 1 through 7, the Lord sent Nathan to David. When he came to him, he said, and now he begins this parable. There were two men in a certain town, one rich, the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb that he had bought. He raised it, and it grew up with him and with his children. It shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Now the traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man, and he prepared it for the use of the one who had come to him. David burned with anger. You talk about, he could see through this problem by this parable. He burned with anger against the man and said to Nathan, as surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this deserves to die. He must pay for the lamb 4 times over because he did such a thing and had no pity. He's adding to it. Then Nathan said to David, this is where a parable hits the blind spot. And Nathan said to David, you are the man. This is what the Lord God of Israel says. I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul. David's heart was rendered in two. And then, of course, I think we all know the rest of the story. But the point of it is that a parable has a way of getting to our blind side. Now, the interesting thing about a parable, and the interesting thing about Jesus' parables, they were produced in the spur of the moment. A situation arises, and Jesus, in the spur of the moment, gives a parable that is so insightful, so meaningful. We think about people who write poems or whatever, and we're trying to digest them and figure out. These things are so complicated in one sense, and yet so simple in the other. The works of art that are composed in what Jesus did in these parables are absolute works of art. Improvisations, as it were, in the dust and the heat of conflict. Because there is a conflict in this parable of the wheat and tares. The tares were wheat. We just talk about the tare itself, a wheat called darnel, or a bearded wheat. The early stages look exactly like wheat, and there were basically 3 ways to possibly harvest them. One is you could reap the wheat over top of the tares because the wheat tended to grow taller, so you just kind of cut the top out of them, and then you come back and you set the whole field afire and you burn the tares. Another one is to go through and separate the wheat and tares, bundle up the tares because you make sure you get rid of them, and then you set the bundles on fire to be burned. The third way is that there's not a lot of tares in there. You just harvest it all, and then you go back and you separate the seed, because the color of the head of the seed of the tare is a little different color. It's kind of a grayish color as opposed to the golden color of wheat seeds if you have just a little, because you don't want to use them. Those are three possible ways in which to do this. Now, what we see in Matthew 13 here in this parable, it's the kingdom of heaven is sowed with good seed on his ground. This is what God has done. And the good seed grows and it produces fruit. So there are several things that we need to understand in the wheat and the tares, is that we have a responsibility as good, hopefully, and I use the term we, and I also notice here, I'm using the term we and the fact that we are good fruit. I'm not even bringing up the question of could we be tares? Because tares look just like wheat in the early stages. It's only by the fruit of that tare do you recognize what it is. What we also need to recognize in this seemingly simple example of the parable here is that there is an enemy. And the enemy has sown bad. The lessons for his disciples. And what brought this part of this up for me is recently I was having a conversation with an individual. We're talking about just people, Christians in general, and Christians who, they attend church, they have all the appearance of things, but in terms of their lives, it appears to be very shallow. You go to church and that's kind of all that there is to it, and you kind of feel good about it, but there is not the kind of action. There may be the argumentation of who they are, because I heard somebody explain to me the other day, they were a Christian because this is a Christian nation. So living in a Christian nation, does that make you a Christian? Any more than living in a Muslim nation automatically make you a Muslim. Now you can be forced to be in either cases. In early times in this country, Christianity was pretty well pushed upon people, and of course we also know the history of crusades. At the same time, we also know the edge of Muslim conversion. But what are the lessons that the disciples needed to possibly learn? Jesus and his disciples, and they have this close relationship with him. But I believe one of the lessons that the disciples needed to learn was the fact that I believe that they were worried about the people that were around Jesus. Not themselves, but other people around Jesus. For example, I'll give you several examples here out of the New Testament. In the book of Luke, we find this example of his disciples questioning someone, and the questioning them from the context of they're not one of us. So again, we have to ask ourselves the question: if somebody isn't a part of us, part of our church, our denomination, our fellowship, if they're not American, if they're not this, how do we feel about them? Well, in Luke chapter 9, in verse 46, we find this example. And what is about this? Remember when Paul was writing to the Philippian church about letting this mind be, and if there's being comfort, if there being love, consider one another and all of that. In this particular case, in verse 46, the disciples were arguing because Jesus said that he would be betrayed and by man. They were arguing over who's the greatest or would be the greatest. So verse 46, an argument started among his disciples as to which of them would be the greatest. Jesus, knowing their thoughts, took a little child and had them stand beside him. And then he said to them, "Whoever welcomes this little child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. For he who is least among you all, he is the greatest." "Master," in this next context, "Master," said John, "we saw a man driving out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he is not one of us." Notice Jesus' statement. "Do not stop him," Jesus said, "for whoever is not against you is for you." Quite a contrast there. So here's this whole huge audience when Jesus is giving this parable. And I'm wondering, as they look out over them, are they standing there like we might stand there and think, the wheat and the tares? You know, these folk out there. Well, that's not the only example. In Luke chapter 19, now we give us another example, verses 5 and 7. We find here a problem with the disciples. In chapter 19, verse 5. And here's what Jesus encounters. "And when Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said unto him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. So he came down once and welcomed him gladly." I'm going to make this statement, and I don't know if that's correct, but I'm just going to make it. Zacchaeus was the 1%. He was wealthy. He was a tax collector. He was the 1% in Israel, and Jesus asked him to come down. So he came down immediately, and all the people saw this and began to mutter. It's murmur. He had gone to be the guest of a sinner. But Zacchaeus stood up and he said to the Lord, Lord, here and now I give half of my possession to the poor. And if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount. And Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is the son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save that which is lost. Wheat and tares. But how would we have considered that in Jesus' day? Now here it says they all murmured. This included his closest disciples. They were complaining against him. Another example, and an interesting one indeed, in Matthew chapter 15 and verse 23. Here's a woman who comes and appeals to Jesus. And we find here that there was a lady that came, and her daughter was afflicted terribly from demon possession. Now, if somebody is demon possessed, demonic, and the like, are they wheat or are they tares? And so she comes to him and is asking Jesus to heal him. Have mercy on my daughter who's suffering from this. Jesus did not answer a word, verse 23. So his disciples came to him and urged him, send her away, for she keeps crying out after this. Get rid of her. Get rid of her. And he answered, I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. Now that's his response. And the woman came and knelt before him. Lord, help me, she said. He replied, it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to their dogs. Whoa. Yes, Lord, she said, but even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall down from their master's table. And then Jesus answered, woman, you have great faith. Your request is granted. And her daughter was healed from that very hour. Now, it is true that Jesus was sent to the lost house of Israel, but her appeal changed his mind about her, and he intervened in her life. Wheat or tares. And I think this speaks to the fact when we look at the wheat and tares in verse 30 of this parable, it isn't over until it's over. And there's things for us to learn. Now, if the lessons for the disciples were that they were thinking they're wheat and everybody else is tares compared to them, what might the lessons for the Pharisees be? Because they could not see a difference between their self-righteousness and the righteousness of God. They considered themselves. And in these lessons that we're looking at, it teaches us that judgment is left to the end of the day and committed into the hands of God. Not so with the scribes and Pharisees. They were busy every day, every moment of the day, making judgments, deciding who's good and who's bad. And in those judgments, they had nothing to do with it, with people who they considered to be, as it were, using the example, tares. Not part of Israel, on the road to Samaria, all the things that they didn't touch anything, they didn't do anything. And their conclusion of Jesus we find in Matthew chapter 9, verses 11 through 13. And again, there were Pharisees among, I'm sure, of this crowd of people who was hearing Jesus on this particular day. But in verse 11 of Matthew chapter 9, when the Pharisees saw this, verse 10, while Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" And on hearing this, Jesus said, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Quite an example for us to understand in terms of wheat and tares. Now let's go back to Matthew chapter 13 and look to his ending conclusion on this. And beginning in verse 29, some lessons that we can learn in verse 29 and 30. So in verse 29, we read this. When they asked, do we need to go out and pull all of these up, get rid of them, and the like? No, he answered, because while you're pulling up the weeds, you may root up the wheat with them. Let them grow together until the harvest. At that time, I will tell the harvesters or reapers, first collect the weeds and then bundle them to be burned, and then gather the wheat and bring them into my barn. There's a lesson for us in terms of the kingdom of heaven. And one of the lessons that Jesus again repeats in the book of John chapter 17 and verse 15, he reminds us that we are in the world, but we're not to be a part of the world, and that he is not taking us out of the world. There is a reason. Yes, Satan has sown bad seed. There is an enemy and the like. But we grow together until the harvest. Now you think, when do you harvest? Well, you harvest when the crop is ripe. And I pick certain things at certain times in my garden because it's harvest time. Not everything is harvested at the same time. I say that to remind us, we can tend to think, that's way off in the future where God is going to do the harvest. But we ought to consider that we have this lifetime in which we live, and we have time to grow and produce fruit. It isn't something that we put off and the like. So I read this thing, and you think, okay, I fully understand. I get it. I can move on. Or we could have taken the approach that, he said it. I understand it I understand it enough. I understand it on the surface. But Jesus doesn't end there, because he comes back, brethren, And to his disciples, again, he explains it, which tells me he understands that they don't fully understand this. So in verse 36, then he left the crowd and he went into the house. His disciples came to him and said, explain to us the parable of the weeds in the field. You think, well, that's simple enough. And he answered, the one who sowed the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed stands for the sons of the kingdom. The weeds are the sons of the evil one, and the enemy who sows them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the harvesters are angels. Now, I want to make this point to us, brethren, because if we're not careful, we will find ourselves being reapers or harvesters. It is the angels, he says, who are the reapers or the harvesters. They're good at harvesting. In my community garden, sometimes people go in there and it's like with green beans, they decide to pick the green beans. And when they do, oftentimes they just tear up the plant. They pull them out and they break the plant and all of that. You got to know how to harvest. And as the person who planted them and wants to reap everything there, I get irritated with them. I think if we're not careful, we can go in and we look around and we say, about people. I think, well, I'm the wheat, they're the tares and the like. No, we need to be very, very careful. So he explains that they will do the harvest, the angels. As the weeds are pulled up and burned in the fire, so will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will weed out of his kingdom everything that causes sin and all who do evil. Now, a weed. It's more than a weed. It's those who do evil. They are going to be harvested and in here burn. The end result is not good. Because we can think, well, I can just do what I want to do and live life. No. There is a harvest. And they will throw them into the fiery furnace where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And then the righteous will shine like the sun of the kingdom of their Father. Who has ears, let him hear. We are not the reapers. We are to be good fruit in God's hands. We are, another way that Jesus put this, we are a light in a dark world. Making the assumption that we are good seed and all of that. The point is, what we have to understand is it's easy sometimes to look at others and make a judgment about them. But Jesus gives us a very, very stern warning. Judge not that you be not judged. We have to be very careful about that because it's amazing what God could do. So let's go back to the example of David and his blindsidedness. David declared that the result that he thought this person should suffer is that not only should he pay it back 4 times, he'd do all these things, but he should die. God came back and said, no, you're not going to die, David. But these things are going to happen and the like. We have to, would we have made that particular judgment? In the law of the Medes and Persians, it would have been your word and then off with your head, so to speak. So I'm just admonishing myself as well as others to look at these parables of Jesus because he's talking about the kingdom of heaven. It is different. In a couple of weeks, I want to give a sermon I think it's going to be entitled The Kingdom of Heaven on Earth, to help us to understand how we live life, how we live kingdomly on this earth. Here's a parable. Jesus gives us many. Many things come to our mind and the like. It is good oftentimes to ask the Lord, Lord, would you explain that to me? Help me to understand. You'll walk away today and hopefully you'll have this picture. When you go out in your garden, and many of you have gardens, and you see the fruit and you see the weeds, you'll be reminded of a parable, of an incredible story that Jesus gave about the kingdom of God and what it is like, and how that he works with that garden and the good seed that he's showing. The wheat and tares, incredible parable on the spur of the moment. Jesus really cuts to the issue. And I just pray for the understanding for all of us to have an appreciation of what God is doing and the harvest that is coming forth. Let's give God thanks in prayer as we close. Father in heaven, thank you very much for this opportunity to come to you today. Father, help us to be productive, and help us, Father in heaven, to have a love for one another and for the work that you're doing. Have an understanding, Father, of your great, incredible kindness, because you are a God of love and grace for all mankind. We thank you for that and the salvation that we have in Christ Jesus, who died for all that we might live. And we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.
The world today is a challenging environment for Christian believers and followers of Jesus Christ. Looking for answers? Grace Communion International local churches in Fairfield, Santa Rosa, and Modesto offers a comforting environment for Christians in search of spiritual growth and development. Contact our local ministry. Attend our local GCI churches at the times listed on your screen.